Hi there, this is episode 95 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. This time my guest is Englishman Ed Lay, who's won fans on social media for his in-depth research into the streets of the Czech capital. Indeed, Ed has already explored the stories of all the streets of Prague's 2 and 3 in daily reportings on Twitter or X, and he's now halfway through the city centre Prague 1. So, how did he get started, and what are some of the most remarkable stories that he's turned up so far? I discuss those questions and much more with Ed Lay for this episode of Prague Talk. Where are you from and what do you do, Ed?
Well, I'm from the UK. I was born in London, grew up in Brighton, but I live in Prague and I work in development aid. So essentially I work for a firm where we review projects which are financed by international donors such as the EU, the UN and national governments. So rather interesting.
And I gather you travel a hell of a lot from what I see online.
Quite extensively, yes. I'd say I'm probably out of Prague maybe about 40% of the time, which does sound quite extreme, but the job is fascinating, the travel is fascinating, and obviously Prague is always a wonderful city to come back to.
And how did you wash up here in Prague?
Well, me and Prague, it's actually quite a long-term relationship. I first moved here in 2006, and as so many people do, I worked as an English teacher. I did that for a year and then I went back to England where I started training for what is now my current job. But obviously I'd made friends in my year here and Prague was always something like a second home. So I was visiting one weekend in 2015 and I just had a lovely weekend with friends and I thought, hang on, maybe I could give this a second shot and being 10 years older, do it better than I had the first time. And I came back in 2016 and have no intention of leaving.
And what is it about Prague that makes it so appealing to you?
It's hard to know where to begin, but maybe especially after 7 or 8 years in London, Prague is just a perfect size. I know there are many Czechs who would laugh at me if I were to say that I thought Prague was small and compact, but that's honestly how I feel it. I love the relative ease of getting from place to place.
Half an hour will get you anywhere, more or less.
Absolutely.
The reason, Ed, that I wanted to speak to you today is because you have a fantastic series of tweets looking at the histories of Prague streets. You started with Prague 3, is that the case?
That's right, yes. That's where I live.
What was the motivation to begin this project? Or was it a project when you began it?
Well, a friend had posted online asking where the name of his street came from. And I've always been someone who, I guess, likes trivia. When I was a kid, I was always learning the capital cities, number one hits, etc. And I saw this post and I thought, that's the sort of thing that I feel I should know. And I wanted to find out. And then I got back to Prague later that day because, surprise, surprise, I was travelling for work. And I went out that evening and now my main street close to me at that time was still called Koněva. And that was quite a hot topic at the time because, of course, Koněv was a Soviet general and there were lots of calls for several years for the streets to be changed to a different name. And, of course, as we now know, that street is called Hartigova, Hartig having been the mayor, the first mayor of Žižkov and essentially the founder of the district. And that evening I went out and I took a picture of the street sign for Koněva and thought, I'm going to write about that. And then something within me decided to take pictures of another 10 street signs around there. And originally the plan was really just to walk down Koněva and write about each of the streets that led directly off it. But it just became too interesting to stop.
And how many streets are there? Or how many streets did you do in Prague 3 alone?
I believe it was approximately 190. And actually, since I completed Prague 3, an additional street has sprung up quite near me, actually, specifically Dagmar Burešové, after the famous lawyer and dissident.
Your research seems to me really extensive and detailed and impressive. What are your resources? Where are you finding the information that you find?
Well, it's actually varied a little bit based on the district. When I was starting with Prague 3, Interestingly, there was actually a fan page for Victoria Zhishkov, which included a list of all the streets and their origins. So that was a good base, but also I would use Czech Wikipedia. I'm currently writing about Prague 1, and obviously many of the streets on there get their own post, which is very helpful. I must admit, I check the Radio Prague archives for interesting stories. That was particularly interesting when I was writing about Nuselský most, Nusle Bridge, about a year ago. And I also try YouTube, just to see if there are any news stories or any recent events on each of the streets. So it's a variety.
And do you come across much stuff on YouTube that's useful?
It depends, yes. At the moment, I'm currently writing about the centre of Prague. So I recently wrote about Národní. So obviously there was a wealth of material for that, in particular related to the protests on 17th November 1989.
Are there any particular stories that you have unearthed in your research that have particularly blown your mind, or things that really made you go, wow?
Well, yes, actually. There's a street in sort of the southern regions of Prague too, which is called Lumirova. And Lumir was a character in the Dvůr Králové and Zelená Hora manuscripts, which, in the briefest terms, were literary hoaxes from the 19th century, which were produced in order to look like Slavic epics from the 15th century, and there was quite a fierce debate about whether they were real or not, but they did achieve the goal of increasing interest in Czech culture and patriotism. And Lumir was one of the characters in those, and it fascinates me that even though it was established that the documents were not real, and therefore Lumir was never a Czech prince who existed, the street still bears his name.
Wow, that's fascinating. Any others that have been particularly interesting to you?
Well, there's different categories, I suppose. So I really love like the in-depth stories like that, or just the opportunities to get to read more extensively about well-known figures who you might not actually know as much about as you think you do. So Václav Havel Square came up recently. It was great to really dig into that. But as we're in Vinohrady at the moment, there's a lot of streets around here which are named after countries and cities. Those were specifically named in 1926, actually, and they were named after Allied states in World War I. And I quite enjoy the streets where there's a bit of a challenge, where there's a street called, it says Anglická, Americká, Francouzská, and I'm thinking I can't just write that's France, or that's England. I feel I have to add something to that. So I've enjoyed trying to find other avenues to go down. So for Americká and Anglická, for example, I started to make lists of famous people from each country who are of Czech origin. And that was quite fascinating.
What about the response you get on Twitter? Do people react more to well-known places, or if you've got like a really great little story you found?
I'd say it's a combination. Now, with the Prague 1 series at the moment, there's obviously quite a lot of photos that I'm posting in each post, and people react well to nice photos on social media. This is a fact. But also, a lot of the really fascinating street names will be in streets which people definitely wouldn't go to as a tourist, and probably not as a local either. And yes, for example, with the Lumirova story, people really do take to that kind of tale.
And do you ever feel like you're getting kind of too far into the weeds? For example, in Jarov, in Žižkov, there are the streets Na Vrcholu, K Vrcholu, Pod Vrcholem, all so similar. Where do you go with that?
Well, those were actually some of the first 10 or 15 posts I wrote about. So back in the day, I must say my posts were somewhat briefer than they are now. I think in those cases, I remembered that not everybody who is reading these is a Czech speaker, so I decided to add some grammar lessons about prepositions, for example.
You're now doing Prague 1. How far into Prague 1 have you got?
I've done the entire west bank of the Vltava, so in particular Hradčany and Malá Strana. I'm currently in the new town, and I have an A to Z map of Prague where each time I've done a street, I highlight it. And on paper, literally on paper, it looks like I've got quite far. But in the old town, there are so many absolutely tiny streets. And so I suspect there may be another 200 of these to go, even though I've done 120 already.
Assuming you stay in Prague for a long time, how far can you imagine going with this project? Will you eventually end up in like Prague 13, wherever that is?
That is the plan. Yes. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head where Prague 13 is exactly, but I look forward to the idea of having the opportunity to find out.
And generally speaking, what would you say you have gotten from this project, from the whole process of doing this research?
This might sound slightly cheesy, but when I was writing about Narodny, for example, I really took time to look at lots of the individual buildings, do a bit of research, find out what they were. And on a thoroughfare like Narodny or Vodlichkova, which I wrote about a couple of days ago, it's so easy to pass through when you're waiting for your tram and not really look at anything and not really think about the history. But in a way, it's almost a bit like falling in love with someone all over again. Like walking down these streets, which I've walked down 100 times, is now a completely different experience. And I'm really seeing how beautiful they are for the first time.
My final question, Ed, for people listening to this who would like to read your research, where can they find it?
Okay, it's on what I believe we're calling X, formerly known as Twitter, at the moment. So that's under my own name. My username is ed_lay. That's Ley. I try to post every day on there, and I'm currently in the middle of Prague 1. And I'm gradually transferring all these onto a website, which has the name of what'sinapraguestreetname.com. Which I like to think is fairly clear. And I'm currently reposting the Prague 2 series on there.
Many thanks indeed to Ed Ley for talking to me, and of course for his fantastic and highly informative research into the streets of Prague. This has been episode 95 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. So there are, of course, scores more editions out there for your listening pleasure. If you're new to the pod, why not check some out and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. But for now, from me, Ian Willoughby, thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.